Hello, this is one of the videos in a series of videos on essentials for astrology research. This is going to be a short video that's an addendum to the fourth video in that series because I realize there's some terminology I want to share with you that's very frequently used in statistics and research methodology, anytime people are doing research, and it will help clarify exactly what the Bonferroni correction is that I talked about in the previous video. So first, the terminology. The terminology is the type 1 error and type 2 error. It's very simple. A type 1 error is a false positive. A type 2 error is a false negative. So a simple example of where type 1 errors and type 2 errors get involved is in medical diagnosis. Suppose we do a blood test for someone to see if that person has a disease. Very often the medical test is not perfect. Some medical tests are perfect, many of them are not. The medical test does some kind of chemical analysis or whatever it does, and it's usually going to be correct. That's why we do the test, but it's not perfect. So suppose you test someone for a disease and you tell the person, yes, you have the disease. But in fact, they do not have it because your medical test is not perfect. False positive. You said they have the disease, they do not. False negative is just the opposite. You give the person a test, you say, yeah, no worries, you don't have the disease, but they do have the disease. It's a false negative. Now, in some situations, we're more concerned about false positives. Others we're more concerned about false negatives. Hopefully we don't have either, but in any case, depending on the situation, you might be concerned more about false positives. In other cases, you're more concerned about false negatives. Now, let me show how we use this terminology to understand the Bonferroni correction. To remind you, the Bonferroni correction is used when you have multiple hypotheses that are done separately. So if you test to see if professional singers have Sun in Taurus, and you compare the professional singers against the shuffled control group, and you see whether the singers have Sun in Taurus with a probability that's very impressive compared to the control group, like P less than 0.05 or less than 0.01. And then you test Moon in Taurus separately. You test the Sun in Taurus separately. You test any aspect separately. And you have this list of each individual thing with its own probability. Those probabilities are actually not correct. They're not even close to being correct because you can only use those probabilities when you're testing one hypothesis. So the Bonferroni correction is a correction to the type 1 error rate, because if you use the p-value that's given for each one, you're going to get a lot of false positives. You're going to say, I know if you're a singer, when you actually don't know. You don't know. So you're saying these people are singers, and they're not, because your p-value has to be corrected. So I just wanted to mention that. And also, a problem with the Bonferroni correction is that it increases the type 2 errors. So you get more false negatives. Anyway, there's a lot of technical details in a lot of these calculations. And also, the Bonferroni correction is what we call a conservative formula. And again, you can think of the word conservative in the context of research methodology as playing it safe. It's playing it safe so we don't think we found a formula that actually works when it doesn't. So it's a conservative correction to the type 1 error rate. In simple terms, what that means is that by applying the Bonferroni correction, you're playing it safe to make sure that you really are finding a formula that works, an AstroSignature that works, and you're not claiming falsely, like you're not exaggerating. That's what I'm looking for. You're not exaggerating how well your AstroSignature works. You're playing it safe, very conservative, so that if you find your AstroSignature works, we're very confident it does. So one of the things you realize about these statistical tests is they're not perfect. Sometimes they're improved and adjusted. The actual Bonferroni correction formula that's used can be more complex than what I described, depending on the context of what's being analyzed. These statistical analyses and these tests can get very complicated and sophisticated. But we don't need to be concerned about that. The very simple concept of a Bonferroni correction that I described, where if you have 10 hypotheses, you should make your probability 10 times more difficult, very simple. That's good enough to get a good sense of whether you're on track for discovering something in these exploratory research phases. When we're doing the final tests, we're not doing individual factors anyway. We're making an AstroSignature. So this is something that we use in astrology only during the model building phase. When we're doing exploratory research, there are occasions where you might want to break up your AstroSignature into individual factors or small groups, and the Bonferroni correction gives you a more realistic and conservative estimate of whether you're on track to finding something. And that's all we want during model building, because during model building, we're just estimating. It's like molding clay gradually into a specific form. So we just want to know if we're on track to reach our destination of finding an AstroSignature that works. And the simple Bonferroni formula that I gave you is good enough for that. But I decided I should have this little addendum because I simplified what the Bonferroni correction is. I avoided the terminology that's more specific about exactly what it does, because I didn't want to overload you with a lot of details that you really don't need to know about. But then it occurred to me that some of you will run into this terminology or are already familiar with it, or might read about Bonferroni correction and start getting confused. So I just wanted to add this additional information, and especially because it's good to know. The more terminology you know, the better off you are when you get into research and you're reading research studies. And so that's all the type 1 error and type 2 error, what they are. And it's a simple idea. Okay, my friends, so that's just a little addendum. I just decided, I probably should explain this rather than skip over it. I'm trying to provide you with the real essential information that you need to do research properly, and not go off into a bunch of esoteric details and fancy footwork that is really not relevant. This is the heart and soul of what actually happens and what you need to do. And I just thought I would fill in a little bit of more technical detail about that because it might be helpful. Okay, my friends, that's it for this little addendum to part 4 in this series of videos on essentials for astrology research. Thank you very much for being a part of this. God bless. Namaste.